Hi, I'm James McGuire, editor of Datamation, and our topic today is big data best practices. To talk about that, we've got four great experts. With us today is Sanjay Sarathi, Chief Marketing Officer of Sumo Logic. Sanjay, how are you today?
I'm well, thanks, James.
And where are you located at? I never did ask
We're
you
in
that.
Redwood City in Northern California.
Fantastic, and I'm sure it must be sunny there today.
It is warm and nice. It's definitely the beginning of summer.
Donna Perlich, VP of Product Solutions and Marketing at Pentaho. Hello to you, Donna.
Hello, James.
And it's Bay Area, right?
Yes, San Francisco.
Downtown San Francisco, okay. Serious rent increases going on there. That's what everyone talks about. Like the real estate in San Francisco is always a big topic of conversation.
Yes, definitely.
Mike Matchett, Senior Analyst and Consultant at Tenasia Group. Hello to you, Mike.
How you doing today?
You're a pundit located where now?
We're up in the Boston area.
Boston area.
We got folks everywhere. I'm in Boston area.
Good deal. And Joelle Kaufman, Head of Marketing at Bloom Reach. Hello to you, Joelle.
Hi, everybody.
Joelle, I was looking for your title online. I came across a photo of you on a motorcycle. Was that you? No, that was a great photo.
Yeah, I get more comments about that photo. If you look hard, you can also find me doing a rock band thing. But the Harley we did a webinar, God, 5 or 6 years ago, called Rev Up Your Revenues. And I went down to the Harley dealer and said, can I take a picture on a bike to use for this webinar? And lo and behold, that picture continues to be my LinkedIn photo, and it is a absolute talking point. But just for the record, I do not ride.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry to hear that because you had the black leather jacket and everything. It looked pretty authentic.
I can do the look.
Yeah. So, big data. I think a lot of people are, they look at big data sort of as a magic bullet. They have it up and running, and sometimes it doesn't always perform exactly as expected. I guess what I would ask the four of you is, what is a typical confusion? What is a typical, challenge or sticking point for companies as they mine their big data applications for insight? What confuses them? What challenges them most often? Donna, what's your sense of that? What's a confusion that people are dealing with big data?
Yeah, I think, depending on where, some of our customers are, a lot of the confusion is really sort of where to start in many cases. I understand that there's some strategic value in accessing this big data that I have, but where do I start and what's the right place to begin? And then along with that, once you've identified, maybe it's, I want to reduce customer churn, or there's just some basic cost reduction I want to do in terms of data storage or meeting my SLAs, then it's really all about, okay, now I've done that, I've identified that problem, and then how do I really approach that? I've got existing technologies in place. I need to be looking at new technologies. Some of them aren't very mature. How do I sort out sort of the fact from fiction? So there's a lot of, I think, those are kind of the biggest challenges that we see.
Sanjay, we talked about this a little bit. I think it seems like one of the confusions is knowing what question to ask. Is that one of the things that trips people up, or what do you see as a big challenge with big data?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think one of and I think Donna hit on it as well, which is where do I start? And there are two ways of thinking about it. One is if you have specific questions in mind, or specific hypotheses in mind that you need to test and questions you need to answer, then that's one thing. But a lot of times people ask themselves, hey, let the data tell me what's going on. And that's challenging in and of itself, because where do you start, to Donna's point? And our belief is that there are times when having a very defined rule set, a very defined set of questions is relevant if you know what the data is and you constrain the data to be about the question. And there are times when that's too limiting, when in fact you're over-optimizing, and sometimes you need to let the data inform you about things you didn't know.
Is there a rule of thumb to know when you are over-optimizing or putting too many rules in place, or is it very situational?
I think it's situational. I don't know if there's a specific rule of thumb that you can apply to every customer in every vertical.
Right.
But oftentimes what happens when we talk with our customers is when they start telling us, oh, I've discovered ABC and I didn't know it was there, and then you automatically understand that the rules are over-optimized.
Huh. Mike, your sense of a big challenge or something that trips people up with big data, what's confusing people?
We tend to talk to a lot of folks on the enterprise infrastructure side, and certainly it matters whether their users are trying to do things in a cheaper way or look for key insight, or they're building an operational advantage application. But on the enterprise side, we see this really confusion on Hadoop being a batch time process for most folks when they just roll it out, and they're really looking for an interactive or more of a real-time kind of answer, and they have to look beyond Hadoop sometimes, or to add on applications or value. So that's one confusion, is people don't quite understand what Hadoop was really designed for as its sweet spot and what takes additional applications. Another thing we see is storage. Big data, it seems like there's commodity disk and commodity disk and commodity disk, and it scales cheaply. But a lot of times the data that has to go in there is already existent in another system. It has to be protected, it has to be replicated, that it has to be secured, and there's a lot that goes into actually the storage side of it beyond simply saying we're just going to use commodity disks. So.
You mean there's an entire different approach to big data storage as opposed to regular storage?
Well, true. So in big data and Hadoop in particular, you tend to use the Hadoop solution, which is HDFS, or Hadoop's distributed file system, and that's built on the cluster itself using just the direct disks on each server node in the cluster, and it replicates the data on there. And you don't really have a storage array. You don't have a third-party storage if you're going with that commodity solution for Hadoop, which is very cost-effective. But at the same time, if you don't have external storage, you don't have a storage array, you don't have a storage admin, you're going to be missing these other enterprise features of reliability and availability and data protection. So that can really trip people up.
Mm-hmm. Joel, your sense of what confuses people when they get up and running with a big data application?
Well, I don't know that many people think they are up and running with a big data application. I think the challenge is people get these, they do have to have a goal. They have to know what they're looking for, but once they find it, they have to be able to do something about it at the speed of the internet. And most people have started with, what data can I now access and analyze? But it's all looking backwards. And there's a lot to learn from history, as your bookshelf often points out. But there is, everybody wants to know, what do I do right now, and how do I get that done? And so when you think about big data, you actually have to not only think about the storage and the rationalization of the data, as Mike said, and what's the right question, as Sanjay and Donna said, but you have to think about, what do I do with the answers, and how do I act on them? And then, is my big data system a learning system that will adapt based on what it observes from the actions I took from what I gleaned from it?
Right. I think I'm sure some businesses get into a sticky situation where, the human hunch tells them one thing, but suddenly the answers that the big data application spits out suggest another thing. So they may have to go against their hunch at times.
It's interesting. There's been some research that came out in the last month or so that actually did testing on outcomes. The human hunch, machine only, and it actually was in the Harvard Business Review. And what they also tested was machine-driven, human-refined. And it turns out that human versus machine, machine will win.
Right.
Machine with human refined beats machine.
Yeah, but then that raises a difficult question, which is really my second question. But isn't big data, ironically, still throw it back to us? I mean, you talk about machine with human refined. What percentage is the human refined? I mean, what does it mean to be human refined? Am I either not overriding the data, but am I choosing one of 6 possible answers to say that's the right answer? I mean, isn't the irony of big data that it throws it back to us? Isn't big data ultimately really about us, or not?
Because we talked about this previously, big data is actually about algorithms, but that doesn't sound as sexy as data. And so what I'm talking about with human intervention, you could look at as tuning of the algorithms, of shaping, and instead of having to understand the math, which is what the wonderful data scientists and engineers do, when you give a very intuitive way for humans to say a little more like this, a little less like that, they're tuning the algorithm, as is human interaction with the output of the algorithm, a natural tuning mechanism if, to Mike's point, there's a way to get that data back in to the system so that the system can learn and that data can be shared in a way that is secure and private and speedy.
Donna, what's your take on the human versus the machine answer with big data? Is big data really just another way of saying we're still making the decisions, we're just getting some more input?
Yeah, I think that we're still at a point where there's always going to be. I mean, part of it is we haven't really talked about this, but is the whole subject of governance, right? We're governing data that we haven't really in the past, right? If you think about Twitter data and doing sentiment analysis, how do you really think about governing Twitter data, right? That's a little bit difficult. I mean, how do you decide what's valid, what isn't? So there's those types of questions. We had an interesting one with a customer, and I was thinking about it. What Joelle was talking is that, basically they were looking at like customer loyalty programs, and they couldn't figure out why there was these weird correlations between people over 65 who go to early bird specials at restaurants, and then something to do with chicken McNuggets, and then there's something to do with like a healthy choice, right? And what they figured out is because people lie, right? They fill out these surveys, but part of what their algorithms were able to suss out in the data was, well, yeah, but people don't always tell the truth. Are we really going to say we ordered the the hamburger, and the curly fries, and the milkshake? Are we going to say
the integrity of the data and
have a special healthy lean next to it? So I think there's always that. I think we're just at a point where until there will be a point where we get to sort of the prescriptive, maybe automatic decisions are made based on what the data is telling us, but probably in a phase where it's still going to be a lot of human kind of final, as Joelle said, well, maybe a little more of this, maybe a little more of that, right. Until we perfect it.
It sounds like a slippery slope, perhaps, but Sanjay, your sense of human versus machine on big data, are we just really running big data ourselves?
No, I mean, I think our philosophy, and I think it echoes what Joelle said from the research, is that the best insights come when you combine human interaction with machine learnings and machine insights. And the reason why that's important is because it's the human beings that have the business context around what's happening, right? Whether it's a seasonal promotional campaign, whether it's a new infrastructure that's put in that's supposed to support a new go-to-market approach, the machine learning will point out an anomaly, will point out something that's unusual in your infrastructure or in the way data is being generated. But it's the humans that are able to say, hey, this is relevant, this is not relevant to my day-to-day working, or even to my strategic thinking. And that's where the tuning comes in. And so we don't, I think I would echo what Joelle and Donna said, you can't separate and you can't divorce the human interaction from the machine learning.
Mike, can you separate the human from the machine learning with big data?
I'm thinking back to the age of coal and steam engines, where you have the hammer versus the pile driver. But I think the analogy I would throw out there is, if you've got bad data and you've got bad analysis and bad judgment or no judgment, then big data is just going to help you drive off a cliff faster, right? So one of the things that we've noticed is data cleanliness and data quality. We're not dealing with big data in a sentient artificial intelligence way just yet. This is still basically a multiplier for looking at lots of data, and if we don't bring the same human judgment to it that we do on small data or any data projects, we're just multiplying that fallacy, I think, a little bit more. Sure.
Yeah, and of course we humans sometimes get the data that we need to know, but we don't want to act on it. I mean, look at the whole global warming question. We have a lot of data on it. Whether or not we're actually acting on that data is a big question, and perhaps a topic for another day. But machine learning, I mean, machine learning is something I've heard a lot more buzz about recently. I went to a conference recently, and I saw a couple of startups that are doing machine learning as a service. Obviously, it's a huge part of big data. I mean, I guess What should businesses know about machine learning? What should they be thinking about machine learning? Joelle, what's your take on that?
Yeah. So, our take is when you know what your goal is, right? So I was reading some of the backgrounds of some of my colleagues, and there's a lot of goals with big data that are about IT optimization and IT efficiency, and that's great. That's not the world we play in. We play in how do you help people discover the products they want to buy more quickly. And so the data has to be clean, but it's always changing. And the thing that is hot today, particularly in fast fashion or anything that has any trending, the data is constantly changing. So you have to have big data applications that are set up to learn, because nothing is, I think you used the word sentient, but I'd say static. Nothing is stable, right? Not even the way people put their structured data together is stable, because if they get a new manufacturer and they send the content a different way, there's always change. So you need to be thinking about what are the levers, if you will, for machine learning. So a lever could be how users engage with, a lever could be pricing changes, learning about, one of the big ones in our space for our customers is learning how products are moving and falling in inventory so that you can adapt what is discovered and what is presented, so you don't present things that have just sold out. So the system needs to be learning from each individual, from each business, and from the entire web to solve a specific problem. I don't think we should leave Donna's opening point, which is you have to know the problem you're trying to solve. Big data is kind of like saying, I have a hammer. Great. Now what?
What nail am I going to pound in with it?
I haven't even gotten to the nail. I just have this hammer.
Right. Mike, your sense of machine learning, what people should be thinking about, be aware of when it comes to big data?
Well, I think the first thing is anybody that's going to tackle machine learning has to have executives or stakeholders or sponsors that actually understand a modicum of data science, enough to say, I understand what a lift curve is, or a ROC curve, or a confusion matrix. And it's a couple hours of internal training, but you can go really badly wrong with a misunderstanding at an executive level of what machine learning is actually doing. So I would caution people about that. And then I think just in terms of big data, there's a couple different approaches. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about this. So there's things that are easily parallelizable, not paralyzed, on Hadoop. And then there's things that require more of a high-performance computing architecture, like simulations and so on. So it's important to also recognize not all machine learning can be done with every architecture, but more algorithms are being ported to more commodity forms of machine learning. And finally, machine learning and really everything going on here is really about discovering correlations and learning behaviors, not necessarily finding causation. So I would caution people to really just understand statistics and probability and a little bit of that. That if you're looking at machine learning, you understand a little bit about why things might have happened, and you can recognize things that will happen in the same way again. It doesn't prepare you for situations you haven't seen before necessarily. And it doesn't really give you necessarily that underlying causation. It just gives you strong correlations. So,
I think you use the term confusion matrix.
Yeah, very confusing to me. But I think that's one understanding that any type of machine learning algorithm is basically making a prediction of something. It's a model of the world, a model of some question, and it's going to come up with true positives and true negatives when it gets the answer right, and it's going to come up with false positives and false negatives when it gets the answer wrong, either wrong one way or wrong the other way. And you put those four numbers together, you get a matrix that you can derive a lot of accuracy scores with about the machine learning model.
And that is the confusion matrix.
That's the confusion matrix, right? Okay.
I'm going to use that term. I really like that term.
There's a data science term for all of you today. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, but if I can jump in on Mike, I mean that's why you need massive. I mean, this is where we go. Massive amounts of data is in order to get those predictions right. You need to be looking at them over large data sets because often you're making minute predictions that in a smaller data set you won't get statistical significance.
Right. You need as many respondents as possible over time.
You do.
The three V's. We can't talk about big data without the three V's: volume, variety, velocity. Uh, Sanjay, your sense. So, are you going to add something, Mike?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think we added up 15 of those V's at one time when we did a survey of the market.
Right.
Variety of just a whole bunch of things having to do with every vector you can imagine. So basically, we look at big data as data that you couldn't be processing before on your traditional legacy architecture, and now you've unlocked this, whatever the vector is.
So, Sanjay, machine learning. What's really important for people to know about machine learning as they move forward with their big data application?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key tenets of sort of machine learning is the idea that the data is going to tell you something, as opposed to you as a human being writing rules all the time to get insight out of the data. And so it goes back to the point that I think we were discussing earlier around pairing human insight with sort of machine learning. The notion of machine learning in a big data setting is that if you don't know your data well enough to even know what questions to ask, machine learning is an incredibly useful tool to provide insights around what might be anomalous, what might be pertinent to a particular subset of users, etc. And then you add in the human dimension around saying, well, do I care about that or not? Because you may decide that as a result of machine learning popping up anomalies in your infrastructure, whether it's on the server side or your new custom application, you may decide to do nothing about it. But that's the human judgment that you get as a result of interacting with that machine learning. So, we use it from an IT perspective to help our customers understand what might be interesting patterns and anomalies in their data. But without the business context, you don't know whether those are relevant or not the first time you see them.
Donna, business context and the machine learning, what's important to know about machine learning?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to keep going back to it, but I think it's all about sort of what your problem is you're trying to solve in the use case. I mean, one of the areas where we found machine learning has become really important is in this concept of, getting this better view of your customer. Oftentimes, I hate to say it, but in the older days, referred to as the 360 view, we all hear about it, but it's really about customer behavior, and it's about really knowing what is the application of that machine learning. So if we think about customer behavior, one of the algorithms that becomes important is being able to score data, right? But again, it needs to be part of that whole data flow process, as Joelle was mentioning. Part of the power of machine learning in the context of big data analytics is we have volumes of data now that can actually refine those models and tune them to the point where they can be pretty accurate. So I think it's thinking about machine learning in the context of the bigger picture of what's the problem that you're trying to solve, and then seeing where it's applicable in a specific use case. So as I mentioned, scoring becomes very important in looking at customer behavior. And that's what we found, is that really tying that into that whole data flow and the integration of these different data sources and managing these big data sources where it becomes really valuable and really powerful from a business standpoint.
I think about machine learning, I'm reminded of that scene from 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the machine says, "Sorry, Dave, I can't do that, Dave." He actually will not let the space guy back into the machine, back into the ship. I guess basically the machine at that point had taken in so much data that it realized that it should no longer have human intervention. I guess we're headed towards that way at some point. At any rate, what about the other emerging technologies that are part of big data? Hadoop, Yarn, Spark. How should people think about incorporating them as they go forward? Joelle, are they always necessarily a part of a big data package?
So, unlike I don't know enough about my colleagues, but what we use in the infrastructure, Hadoop, Cassandra, MapReduce, what have you, is not really useful or meaningful to our clients. What they do is they want to plug into a web service and get the data they need from us, the prediction that I think Mike was talking about, the data that we say should be on the page based on that, and then feedback, again, through the data feeds, what happened. And so whether or not we move infrastructures or improve or optimize something, that really is about the quality of the predictions, the speed and the volume, but none of that is exposed to the client in our case. And I think clients have to be very intellectually honest with themselves. We've had clients who, very, very large companies, who have said, we need to own this, we're going to build ourselves. The problem comes back to, in the world of e-commerce, the probability that you're seeing enough consumer traffic yourself, even if you're one of the biggest in the world, is very low. I think after Amazon, the next largest sees maybe 7% of the shopping traffic at Google, Amazon, and then everybody else.
You said even that is not enough traffic for that those number 3 or 4 players?
It's not. It's not enough. And it's not enough when you start fragmenting things into different channels, different products, the long tail. And so, you have to be honest about, can you retain and hire the data scientists to build and create and maintain these complex systems, or should you be looking for the absolute best-in-class applications using big data and plug into them? And if you will, think of it as having the VC community funding labs of the best data scientists and find the one solving your problem, and then plug into that. So I'm not sure that the rampant pursuit of Hadoop and building it ourselves is actually the core competency, or the data, nor do they have the data, nor do they have the people to do.
You're saying that many people really don't need to concern themselves, many business people don't need to concern themselves with Hadoop or MapReduce or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I may be disagreeing with Mike, but I think business people should be focused on what are the most important things I need to solve for the business, and then either with their own people or with their business partners, say what applications can solve these problems the most efficiently, the most reliably, on an ongoing basis.
Mike, how terribly wrong is Joelle there when she talks about not needing to worry about Hadoop and MapReduce?
No, I think she's actually right on when it comes to talking to business people about what their needs are and getting their needs met. And if you step back and look at big data, it came from Google, it came from Yahoo, it came from Facebook. These are technologies that came out of those things. People that use Google don't think about big data when they go do a Google search, right? So, I think to that case, if you've got an idea of doing consumer research or e-commerce research or the various cloud-hosted SaaS-type solutions, you ought to go and look at what people have already built and assembled and do a TCO study versus building it yourself. And in many cases, you'll come out far ahead by leveraging, as Joelle said, something that someone's already got leveraged work put into. But I think we're also seeing in a lot more IT enterprises the role of Hadoop and other technologies coming out for more than simply those it's kind of, I don't want to say Web 2.0 kinds of applications, but those really high-profile applications. We're seeing people using Hadoop really as a fundamental platform for offloading from their BI and data warehouses. We're seeing it using as a data lake or a data hub. In some cases, we're seeing them use them for operational intelligence on their internal business processes. So I think big data platforms are still going to proliferate, although you may not see the high-end apps develop because people truly don't have the data scientists, as Joelle was saying. So, and then just to sort of answer your original question, I think another problem that Joelle could have pointed out too here is that Hadoop is not a one-size-fits-all answer. You do need things like NoSQL databases. You do need things like Spark, which is a different kind of architecture than Hadoop that runs in parallel with it for real-time operational stuff. You do see some exploding ecosystem of pieces to have to try to manage. So it can be tough to put together your own big data solution.
Donna, should people be concerning themselves with Hadoop and Spark and Yarn and the sort of other emerging technologies, or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think, from a big data perspective, we always have thought about it as it's not just what's in Hadoop or in that NoSQL data store. I mean, the real power, and this is sort of what research is showing too, is in the data that you can actually store now in Hadoop or in NoSQL data stores, and then maybe some data that's in your data warehouse, right, or your operational data, or to Joelle's point, maybe it's data that's in another application. But when you take that data and you combine it with operational data, that gives you a completely different view of your business per se, or gives you an ability to answer questions that you couldn't before. So getting to the Hadoop piece of it, what we found is it's mostly I've got to capture all of this weblog information, and I'm capturing that in Hadoop. But again, and maybe I have a select set of data scientists that spend time, refining algorithms with that data that's coming through. But then the real power comes in when you can bring that together with, say, some operational data that you have in a relational database. I can bring those data sources together and push that out to a business user who just wants to look at a dashboard every day. Or it's almost like it's just offering that access out to a broader set of users, and that's where it becomes really powerful. We find in terms of the things like Yarn and Spark and Shark and all the other wonderful technologies is, it's a don't boil the ocean, right? So if you're just trying to offload your data warehouse and you're going to stand up a Hadoop cluster to do that, perhaps over time you may find that there's data sets in there that can be refined and put into an analytic database, and again, you can have your average business user running some types of analytics off of that. So it's all about really looking at where is the point where, for instance, with Storm as part of Yarn, where is that real-time component going to become so critical to my business that I'm going to need to look at a technology like that? And again, it's proceed with caution, right? There's so much out there. As a customer, you've got to understand what your use case is, what your business problem is you're trying to solve, so that you don't go head first into some technologies that really haven't been tried and tested yet at this point. Lots of interesting technology out there. We spend time in our labs looking at it, but maybe not ready for prime time in some cases.
Sanjay, it seems like the consensus or near consensus is many business decision makers can just use a single dashboard and not think too much about Hadoop or MapReduce. Is that your sense of things?
Well, I think one of the biggest benefits of Hadoop and all the underlying technologies and components has been for service providers, technology providers, vendors to incorporate the technologies or the principles underlying those. And so from the perspective of an end user, a business or a company, I think one of the things that's been really interesting for us has been companies not necessarily asking us the differences between how they do it themselves and going with a vendor, but how we've incorporated some of those principles in our own service. And so and I think that part of the education is starting to happen more and more, which is there has to be a rationale, a business reason for doing it, for using these technologies. And as long as you can explain how you're using it, why you're using it, what the ultimate benefit is from an application perspective, then I think most companies are pretty comfortable saying, hey, for a purpose-built application, I'm not going to go off and try and recreate what company X has done or company Y has done. And I think that's what's happening, is that there's enough evidence out there of how these technologies work that companies are asking their service providers and their vendors questions about their implementation of these technologies. And that's almost the best benefit.
Oh, they actually want to get under the hood a little bit.
Well, they want to understand how your particular service is using it. And now, once again, different than Joelle, we sell to IT and security professionals and folks who want to understand some of the innards of it, because they have to hook this into their infrastructure. And so, they're oftentimes making a buy versus build decision. And when they're doing that, our ability to help them understand sort of that underlying architecture is a bit of a, milk and cookies sort of situation where they feel comfortable after talking to us.
You mean they get the milk and cookies, meaning they get comfortable with it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Joelle, say there's some hypothetical customer who comes to you for actual advice on a tip or two on managing their big data application. Is there some advice you give that poor misguided soul? I mean, they're lost. There's so many numbers, so many conclusions. What's simple? How would you simplify it down for them?
Well, unfortunately, big data has become used as the hype word for everybody that does anything with data. And so I think I'd say to them, ask what their application predicts, ask how successful those predictions have been, either in tests or with other clients, but you want to know what is it actually predicting, and what data is it using to make those predictions, because the vast majority of people that are calling themselves big data aren't. They're data. And the
What's the dividing line there? Who are the people who are calling themselves big data but who really aren't?
So I think people that are using only data that's available in your organization, to me, that's the same old data, maybe managed better. I think Mike pointed that out. And that's fine, manage it better. But if you're a big data application, you should be bringing together data from disparate sources. You should be learning from multiple sources and bringing together large groups of data and then making predictions, algorithms that are making predictions that are usually right. And those are the things you want to know. So just hearing big data, don't check that off. You want to say, well, what are the data sources? What kind of predictions do you make? How does your system learn and tune? How do I tune your system? And those are the sorts of questions to get just a layer below the hype and below people saying, we use Hadoop, or we use Spark. You know, like if you're not a technology architect and not going to be able to go deep into the trade-offs between the different systems, or you really shouldn't have to, then those are the questions I would ask.
Donna, what advice would you give someone if they felt they were sort of floundering a little bit, or not? How would you simplify the process down a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things I think that have emerged after listening to all of the other folks on the call here. I think, the first one, again, is I keep going back to it, but, understand what it is the problem is you're trying to solve. And in that way, look at where there are actual patterns emerging in terms of the use cases that customers have they're being successful. So I think somebody else mentioned, I think it was Mike, about offloading a data warehouse, right? That's something we've seen now for the last couple of years, that's where people have used successfully. They see a reduction in cost. Okay, logical place to start. Maybe not for every organization, but that's something, if that's where your needs are driving to, there are plenty of people you could go to and learn from and see how they implemented that particular solution. So, I mentioned before kind of understanding customer behavior, this idea of a customer 360, where maybe you've got some data that's in Hadoop, and now you're able to bring that in with some operational data and get a better view of your customer, prevent churn. So I think it's really being kind of practical about understanding the real business use cases out there and who's been successful with them. And then, one of the things that's come up over and over and is showing in the research, and Joel mentioned that in terms of talking to the business, it's more important than ever, and we went through this a long time ago in the days of data warehouse, and we swung the pendulum of, oh God, IT's got to control everything. There's only going to be 6 BI tools that are allowed to be used, and we're going to manage that. And what happened? Well, business users went off and figured out there was better tools and went around IT, and we're kind of coming back to, all right, but so now we've got these great tools out here, but we still have to have a back-end IT management of all this data that's coming in. And so bringing those two as a process, less about the technology and what you might use, whether it's Hadoop or Shark, how do you bring together the folks in your IT organization and the business so that you can actually come up with a solution that's going to be successful? Because that's where a lot of things fall down too, right? Things are being built that aren't useful to the business, tools are being used in the business, and then the data isn't governed and we get bad data. So I think that's another piece of it that's really important.
Mike, your advice to the company who's looking for some management advice, how to handle their big data application?
Yeah, I don't know if we have the 3 hours to go into all the aspects of this, but I think Donna actually covered a lot of what I would say first, which is understand what you're trying to do first and try to work from that and keep that clear.
I think one of the problems that businesses run into with that is they may not even know, because they're not even sure what the application can spit out. So they kind of have an idea, but maybe they're not even asking the right questions.
Well, then I think, and honestly, they're actually in a data mining or data exploration phase, and that is itself a goal. Bring some data together and explore it and mine it and visualize it and see what you have. Mm-hmm. But if that's the goal, then just be cognizant that that's what you're trying to achieve, and you're not going to get an operational benefit or a business process benefit, as Joel might point out. Right? You're just exploring. So it's an investment in research, not an investment in operations. at that point. So if you're clear on what you're trying to do with it, I think you'll be a lot more successful. Just more practical advice. It's clearly we've talked a little bit about SaaS versions, software as a service versions of big data applications. We've talked about bringing Hadoop inside. You can also run Hadoop in a virtualized way on a Hadoop cluster to spin it up and down very fast for development purposes. You don't have to go out and build a big piece of infrastructure to play with it. You can even run Hadoop on your laptop, and I've got a couple versions actually running on mine here in virtual boxes. So it's not something you have to go to play with and go build big things.
But wait, what's the practical value of running Hadoop on your laptop?
Well, you learn the management of it. You learn what some of the constructs about how it operates, and you start to figure out what exactly it might be good for when you do scale it up. If you're starting out there, versus going out and buying a 10-node cluster, 100-node cluster from Dell and getting the racks moved in and going, oh my gosh, what do I do with this now? I got to use it because I bought it, right? And my VP says, do we have a big data solution? And I say, yes, it's over there, but no one really knows what it's doing. So that's just a words. I also just I'll throw in something here too. Is I think part of Hadoop happened because servers got cheap. CPU got cheap, disks got cheap, servers got cheap, and it was easy to scale them out. So you could create software like Hadoop that took advantage of that to solve new classes of problems. One of the things to sort of look for next on the horizon is what happens when memory gets cheap enough. You start to see in-memory solutions coming and more memory-oriented things happening even around Hadoop itself. So if you want to look forward a little bit, you might look at that. But in terms of management, you can try small. You don't have to start with the biggest of pieces.
Sanjay, your advice to the big data user? How do they move forward, or how do they simplify it?
Wow, I don't know if I don't want to repeat what everybody already said, but it can't. I think the one point I would leave the listeners with is it can't just be about technology. One of the things that we've discovered is oftentimes a first deployment of the service impacts more people than the original IT team thought, and so oftentimes they're scrambling to help others understand the value of that data. So you just need to think through the people and the business processes that are going to be intertwined with the data and the analysis of that data, because I think that has a huge impact on how people are going to absorb it and whether people are going to be comfortable with expanding their use of said technology or said applications for the near-term future.
I think we're pretty much out of time, but I'd like to have the four of you just sort of briefly wrap up, where we're going with this, because I think it helps people to manage if they know where big data is going. It's a big question, of course, but I mean, if you look, say 1, 3, 5 years out in the future, where is this going, and how is that going to help people manage? Sanjay, why don't you take us home with that?
Sure. I think one of the areas that's going to be very interesting for everybody is that increasingly big data and sort of security are going to be intertwined. If you think about 15 years ago, most applications were running in a data center. Most data was getting generated from application servers and networks, and now with the growth of hybrid infrastructures, cloud computing, BYOD, etc., that data is getting generated everywhere, right? Not just within the confines of your own environment. And so, I think the ability for people to understand the security implications of what's in that data, how people are securing it, and how people are using it, whether that's within the company or outside of it, is going to become an increasingly important question for people to ask. And I think those worlds are going to blur together because it's happening already.
Mike, where are we going with big data 5 years from now? Where is this? What are we going to be talking about?
So I think I mentioned a little bit about memory becoming a cheaper resource. So I'll leave that. But I'll say something about the Internet of Things because it hasn't come up yet. And I think what we're seeing is more and more things like thermometers and cars and toasters, fit devices you wear on your wrist and your iPhone, producing data streams. There's just going to be more and more data. Data is not going to stop increasing for any foreseeable future. So we think we have big data today. In 5 years, we're going to have humongous amounts of data out there. And it's not that we're necessarily going to get swamped by it, but the opportunity is going to be to who can leverage that amount of data the best and fastest to get to value. And they'll be extremely ramping up the competition within verticals, within current industries, within new industries. And I think today, right now, big data hasn't really touched a lot of existing industries as much as it has sort of the Web 2.0 kinds of companies. And we're just now starting to see big data coming into the rank and file enterprises and moving into even small and medium businesses and providing them value. I think in 5 years, we're going to be starting from a very different perspective. You just aren't going to run a business of any size without having to deal with data that's beyond imagining today. Basically big data is
beyond your own business, as Joel mentioned.
Yeah, big data. I mean, it's basically going to become a data-driven world, and you just will have to be able to work and deal and talk and be conversant in all these new things we've been talking about today.
Joel, the future of big data, and people are going to look back at this video 5 years from now. They're going to say, "Well, she really knew what she was talking about."
I doubt that, but I'll give it my best shot.
Okay.
I think that we're going to see. It's interesting. I don't disagree with Mike. The world should become more data-driven, but again, research is showing that the more data there is, the lower the percentage of data-driven decisions that are made.
Really?
So it is, and particularly among marketers. They're drowning in it, and the winners will be those that can figure out the right data to use, as opposed to the most data. And you need large data sets, but you need to focus in very carefully. I think we'll see the rise, here's a new buzz term, it's getting some momentum, of thick data. And thick
data.
Big data. Big data.
True confession, that's a new one on me. So please tell us what thick data is.
Thick data is, and it's not my name, it was in another publication, I won't name it for you.
Okay.
They're talking about how that's big data with human insights and human overlay, and that it's this overlap in the Venn diagram of large amounts of data, smart algorithms, and insightful people. And everyone on the call has talked about that. The buzzword we've heard about it is thick data. So we'll have people winning because they choose the right data, the thickening and the making of data more valuable by human insight, and then the third, I'll predict, we're actually going to get a lot smarter about data and content. Because the frontier that we're on, that we won't be alone on, is the ability of computers to understand content and then be able to make predictions about what content is relevant to what situation.
What do you mean by content? You mean articles and videos?
Yeah, everything. Yeah, whether it's images, articles, videos. Today, the way that's done, the big, dark, dirty secret, is it's done by humans categorizing and trying to group things so that the databases can put them all together. But that you can't keep up, it's nonsensical. And so the future is computers that actually read and understand the content with human guidance and input, and then transforming content marketing and publishing and editing and all the things that we're doing day to day, and giving us guidelines and suggestions about, hey, not even suggestions, sometimes doing it for us, putting forth A instead of B, C, or D.
It's not going to put the editors out of business, is it, Joel?
I started with thick data. We will always need, humans are much better authors, and humans have emotion and can understand the emotional impact of different decisions. Computers are not good at either of those things.
Donna, the future of big data, where are we going a few years
Oh, man, after that, I have no... I just keep thinking about when you said when we watch this in 2 years, it's like, oh, yikes, it's going to be scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, part of what's difficult is, we didn't have Instagram 2 or 3 years ago, right? Now there's Instagram data we have to deal with. There wasn't Twitter at one point. It's like we have no idea, right, of what type of data we might be collecting in another 6 months, for instance. I mean, it's almost too hard to predict. But I do think that a lot of the technologies we've seen, like Hadoop, some of the NoSQL data sources, some of just the tools that have made things simpler. I think we'll see things become simpler and more reliable and less complex, just because there'll be a demand for it, because there is value in this data to organizations. And then I think, one of the other things that Mike brought up was the Internet of Things. So I think that the power of, collecting sensor data and collecting behavioral data in terms of sentiment, those things are going to become really important, especially as you blend them and combine them with other data sources. And so things like predicting failures and understanding demographics and customer behavior will become more and more sort of bread and butter for every organization. They won't be sort of out there in terms of the things that we're capable of doing. So, it's really just, I think over time it's got to get simpler and it's got to get less complex.
It's got to be true. I mean, I would certainly bet on that one, the need for simplification of it. That is a lot of really great stuff. I appreciate the four of you joining us. I will send you all a link. And let me press my applause button here because I think it's important. There we go. It's a Google effect. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.